Hey y'all, I'd quickly like to drop in before the video starts to say that this video is made purely as something for me to do while I'm just waiting for whatever happens next and just trying to find time to record. I found some time and I recorded, so if the quality is not the best, I'm very sorry about that. But please enjoy. And for to the YouTube manual reviewer, everything that's from this video has been properly censored for a channel of my size. Um, uh, Thank you. Have a great day. All right, hello everybody. I thought I'd try something new. A little bit of reaction content, just because I need to put something out because it's been a while. If you're surprised to see a VTuber model, you shouldn't be if you've been dropping by the streams. It's usually pretty chill. Yeah, please drop by the streams. It helps out a lot, especially with my self-esteem, because it's never really high, ever. But here we are. I'm here with my little guy. I've upgraded, for those who have seen the streams, a little bit from the little 2D guy to this now. So hopefully that's better. Hopefully that's a little bit, nicer and all that. But we're going to get into this is slavery's worst conspiracy theory. Now, before I get in, I would like to mention that there are opinions in this video, both from him and from me. So if you don't like that, you can dislike the video or just, stop watching here. It is completely all on you. You don't have to watch this video. I'm not making you. So, yeah. I've only seen like the first 3 seconds of this. I've not watched the other 3 videos. Actually, I've watched all 3 of these. Never mind. But I don't remember any of it. So we're going to hopefully get a quick recap. And yeah. But as we get in, I'll throw some opinions, some of my knowledge in there, which isn't much. I don't know much about, all too much about American history that far back, but we'll see.
I've made a good few videos about arguments relating to slavery by now, and while I've always been happy with their performance and feedback, there's often plenty of people besides who will pretty consistently miss the point behind those videos, that they aren't just about slavery itself, but rather they're about rhetorical devices. They're about the study of history and of propaganda, and how these different elements might be used even today to sway individuals towards certain disturbing ways of thinking. Now, in the specific case of these videos, they're used as a means of lessening the evil which the transatlantic slave trade represented and its lasting impact on our societies today. Sometimes this is a purely historical, flawed argument. Other times, however, most times I would argue, these lines of reasoning are for very, shall we say, pointed, even political purposes today.
Okay, so what I'm going to say to that is this is a lot of times people like this will align themselves very heavily with the alt right. And from what I can tell, they kind of miss the point of the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War was the Confederates seceding from America. They were trying to be non-American, and I think that's kind of lost on these people. So, yeah.
So I figured that for this video, I would change things up a little bit and put the cart before the horse, as it were. Now, the immediate argument, really it's more of a conspiracy theory, that I want to discuss today is the idea that the slave trade was dominated, even outright controlled, by the Jewish population.
So we're going back to blaming the Jews again, aren't we? The only thing of note that the Jewish people really did in history, disregarding what they're doing now, or not even the Jewish people are fighting back against that as of less than 24 hours ago, as of recording this. But it's in a lot of cases, just immediately blamed on the Jewish population, especially in America and other countries. But that's not always true. In a lot of cases, it's more. How do I put this? How do I word this? It's more about finding a scapegoat than it is actually blaming somebody for the actions. And it's more trying to pin it on the Jewish population in order to create a anti-Jewish rhetoric. Because if they did all this bad stuff in history, then we can justify what was done during other times of interest, specifically the early 1900s, like 1890s through the 1940s is roughly a time frame I'll put to that. And yeah, it's not exactly the best argument ever in any circumstance without, like, it's without reason. There's no actual evidence for this.
They, rather than any other group, which those who purport this idea would typically self-identify with. More often than not, this is the idea of the white European as
Whoa,
a singular
that's a flag.
ethnic bloc, which doesn't really make all that much sense, but, consistency is hardly a conspiracy theorist's strong suit.
Yeah.
Now, this idea is outright nonsense, and it's easily disproven, and I'll discuss exactly how wrong it is in the latter half of the video, but like I said, cart before the horse today. Because unfortunately, for the majority of the audience that actually needs to hear this lesson, well, nothing that I could say could possibly convince them. Conspiracy theories, and especially the kinds that involve shadowy cabals ruling the world, are infinitely malleable. They're unbeholden to reality. They can expand and contort in whatever fashion is necessary to disprove whatever might run contrary to them. Any of these statistics that I bring up, lies by the Jewish media. Archival sources that you can go and read yourself, fabricated documents. It's an entire global network that controls every little thing and every person, except, of course, for the conspiracists themselves, because I guess through their use of the, typically they say, Jewish-controlled mass social media, well, there's just no way that we can possibly stop them. I mean, you have no idea how...
Oh. Oh, we're gonna bring up Kanye. Okay. We're gonna go back a little bit just to kind of reiterate this point.
Little thing in every person, except, of course, for the conspiracists themselves, because I guess through their use of the...
I think this is a good image to stop with. Basically, the root of this is to find the Jewish population responsible for any wrongdoing, so that you can justify historical events that will not be named. And yeah, and I think the best way to properly combat this is to just, well, there's no real proper way to combat this, because the people that are spreading this misinformation may even know that it's not true. They just want to spread hateful rhetoric. But if we go back a little bit more, a lot of this kind of thing here, you'll notice this is a very traditional German Wehrmacht or SS uniform here. I'm not quite sure because it's the back and it's also not colored. But basically, a lot of propaganda that you'll see depicts, especially anti-Jewish propaganda, will depict the Jewish population as being a thorn or a knife in somebody's back, or a controlling force of the world. And in a lot of cases, it is purely fear mongering. That's all it is. That's all it's ever really been. Trying to. Okay, go back to
is by the
this.
Jewish media. Archival sources that you can go and read yourself. Fabricated documents. It's an entire global network that controls everything.
So you'd think, right? This is the point I was trying to make earlier. I kind of forgot it for a moment. You'd think if there was a giant world-spanning organization that controlled everything, they wouldn't just leave hints about it, like at all. That would be the last thing. Like if you were a global world-spanning controlling organization, you probably wouldn't want anybody to figure out that you were. That's kind of amplified here. And I think that's kind of lost on some people. Here, let me move myself up a little bit so I can talk with a bit more authority here. Basically, there's not any reason why, if anything, right, the Jewish are like one of the last people on the list of people that might be trying to create a social thing, right? Because, you know, there's be no point for them to do that.
Every little thing in every person, except, of course, for the conspiracists themselves.
That is also really silly. Like, if here I don't remember the exact quote, but it's like if you meet one jerk in any given day, they're probably the jerk. If every single person on a given day is a jerk, then you might want to take a step back and realize that you're probably the jerk and not the people, not every because the statistical likelihood of you running into every single person that you run into or talk to or attempt to communicate with is a jerk is so incredibly low that odds are there's more of a common denominator, if anything.
Because I guess through their use of the, typically they say Jewish-controlled mass social media, well, there's just no way that we can possibly stop them. I mean, you have no idea how many of our agents that...
Calm as ice, even though you're typing tweets in complete caps. Just gonna...
Kanye West has managed to dodge by this point. Man is practically Tito. Now I've touched on these ideas, right, on these themes, how myth can build itself up on misconceptions in my videos about the Holocaust. Oftentimes, these are simple misconceptions, or at the very least, they're misconceptions that are simple to comprehend in a way that something like the logistics of a genocide might not be simple to understand. And that's what makes our understanding of history so important, because it helps us to guard against conspiracy.
Now, this is getting a bit closer to my realm of expertise, which is the early 20th century, like the 1900s, the early 1900s, the early 20th century, early 1900s, that kind of region, anywhere to like now. That's kind of my area of expertise, is where we're getting.
Conspiratorial thought, and to counter it whenever we happen to see it in the wild. Now, although for those who have unfortunately fallen prey to the conspiracies, I don't believe that they need a historian to pull them out of the rabbit hole. They need a psychologist, they need a philosopher, because the problems are typically running much deeper than mere history. They're being rooted in personal insecurities. Now, in this case, the deeper...
So, with that personal insecurities thing, one thing I see a lot is a lot of times people will get angry at things that they are projecting themselves. Say for, certain groups of people. You know what? I'm gonna stop with the whole trying to be kind of ambiguous. I'm just gonna start like name dropping at this point. The far right often accuses the far left of being Nazis and fascists, and if anything, the far left is not that. And if we look at the far right and what they want from, you know, what they want to turn America into at this point is entirely exactly what they say they're fighting, right? And it becomes just this kind of vicious cycle of, well, you're the fascist. No, you're the fascist. Or insert whatever thing that you want to say is bad. And it's a back and forth between everybody. And I think neither of the far political sides are correct on this ever. So that's just what I'm going to say on for that. Is that I don't really think that any given political system or side is correct. I'm just going to say that I think that each side has valid opinions, but some of them I don't agree with. They're all valid opinions. Everybody's opinion is valid, right? But some of them can be discarded. But that's just again my opinion. So you can take that however you want to take that.
deeper meaning behind the Jews ran the slave trade argument is quite clear. Among other things, it's an unfortunately common form of tribalism. The conspiracist, again, they're typically going to identify themselves, rightfully or not, as a white Christian, as a single cohesive
We are really name dropping here, aren't we?
block that is in conflict with the singular block of, for example, the Black African, or, of course, the biggest boogeyman of them all, the Semitic Jew.
So this really isn't a good. We're gonna go back a little bit so we're not on that screenshot. What I'm gonna say to that is tribalism is often part of human nature. It's always like if you go back and look at history, basically every single thing, every war, every conflict can be like every conflict can be looked at, and you can usually find an us versus them mentality. That's where conflict starts, especially more physical conflict like wars.
Tribalism. The conspiracist, again, they're typically going to identify themselves, rightfully or not, as a white conflict with boogeyman of them all, the Semitic Jew. They also identify themselves, of course, these individuals, as being good. Very few people would not identify themselves as being more or less good.
Yeah, and that's another thing, that kind of us versus them mentality. Us, we are good. Them, they are bad. We fight them because we don't like them. Or we don't agree with them.
And they believe that, again, there are outsiders, there are these other ethnic blocks that are not only disparaging and disrespecting them, but even actively combating them based on their identity. It's a warped worldview, but that's a whole other conversation.
And you start to see this, especially when you get into modern politics, especially with the right wing being such a prominent like thing. You'll start to see, as you get into more modern times, less of the prosecution of people for the sake of prosecuting them because we don't like them, and you'll start to get into these arguments of, well, they're trying to prosecute us and they're bad because they're trying to do what we're going to do to them because we're only doing it to them in defense, and that makes us good but them bad, and it starts to really devolve past that point.
I don't think I need to convince you of that. But the overall point is that whatever the person is identifying as the foreign entity, right, whether it's racial or religious, whether it's political or anything else of the sort, if it's the foreign entity, it's not me, it's something else, well, if I'm good, they must be bad. Now, surely.
Yeah, and that kind of ties back into that us versus them mentality. This is a very seventh grade social studies kind of thing. That's actually where I learned that the kind of like us versus them thing is kind of where you'll learn that in seventh grade, and a lot of times you can learn to avoid that us versus them mentality, but unfortunately, there's not really any way to combat it in the same way that you'd combat like disinformation, right? Because on a lot of times people in a lot of like cases people will follow their religious or not religious political doctrine no matter what anybody says, so there's not really much you can do about that kind of mentality, unfortunately.
We, of course, as the good ones, couldn't have ever been involved in slavery. And of course, if we, if the white Christians were involved in slavery, it must have not been so bad as it's always made out to be. Or at the very least, we couldn't have been involved anywhere near so much as those guys over there.
The only thing I'm going to say to this is when you start to look back at when you start to look at generational wealth, especially in America, where does it come from? Usually comes from here. A lot of it comes from here. And that's one thing, is that a lot of people will try to downplay history. Like if you've ever seen that in, I think it was like Idaho or Indiana, is this history textbook it was a page about Rosa Parks. It starts off telling mostly the truth. Rosa Parks was told to go to the back of the bus because she was an African American woman sitting in the white section of the bus, and she had to give her section up, or her seat up, for the white passenger, right? And it would slowly devolve into she was told to move, she didn't, she got arrested. And it takes away the main point of learning about Rosa Parks. And I think that's not a good thing. I don't think anybody would agree that that's a good thing.
Be they Jewish investors, African warlords, or again, whatever, however you want to draw these lines, it's all nonsense. So you can draw them however you want to, right? But the point is that we inflate the other's evil and we downplay our own, all that is good within ourselves, all that is evil within them.
Again, that really goes back to that us versus them mentality. God, we're 22 minutes into the recording and we're 6 minutes into the video.
And unfortunately, in this day of politics by outrage, where everything is more about owning.
And this is kind of, how do I put this? This is not like, this is that kind of, I'm better than you, I am the us, you are the them, I'm trying to ostracize you from me and everybody who follows me, because that's just part of how I gain support in the first place. And I'm not going to change it, because if I changed it, then the people that supported me before wouldn't support me anymore. So it's the same kind of thing.
The other side than actually getting anything done, well, this kind of tribalism, whether again it's about race or anything else, is exceedingly common. It has never been harder and never been more important to eschew partisanism, to police one's own side, and to understand the conditions behind the issues that we face.
And I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand in modern times, where it's a lot of people should police their beliefs and not change it based off of the changing political like spectrum of the side that they've followed for so many years. I think that's one thing that's kind of a problem, especially in America, where people will change their beliefs on a whim, as the political leader of their party does. Save with Russia and Russian American relationships over the past few years have been generally America hates Russia, Russia hates America. But after Donald Trump takes office, we are suddenly buddy buddy with Russia, and it's it's a lot of just kind of you need to police your own beliefs. You need to follow your own beliefs, and if you don't agree, you shouldn't always agree with the person in charge just because they're in charge. That leads to fascism. That leads to Nazism. That leads to a whole host of other things that are just not good.
And that is why I'm actually very happy to be able to say that this video's sponsor.
So, do I do the sponsor segment? I mean, I don't have any sponsors, but I'll just judge this sponsor segment. If you're wondering, this is Brandon. That I'm gonna butcher that. This was posted 13 days ago. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. This is an amazing creator, by the way. But I will show his advertisement section. Just and we'll judge it as an advertisement section, devoid of the video itself.
Sponsorship is directly related to that cause. Now,
okay, ground news. Maybe we won't. One thing I can say about ground news is it's good for people who don't want to spend the time on their time, their day to day on just figuring out, well, is this like is this like news outlet, is this left or right? And it's like most people can just tell by looking, right? But I'll judge the advertisement section for it being the advertisement section.
We're going to have a brief message on that sponsor's behalf before we finally tear into the nonsensical argument. Ground News is an extraordinary organization in the news media world. They aren't the...
I'm going to say that that's a pretty nice audio transition. It is definitely a bit more open. Oh, my microphone. It is definitely a bit more open comparatively to the rest of the video, because I'm assuming this he recorded this like in something like in at least a bit closer to his microphone than he was in there. But that's the only thing I have for this so far.
The ones directly reporting on the news. Instead, what they do is gather related articles from all around the world, from every political and social stripe, and collate them all in one place. Take, for example, the situation in Gaza. Oh yes, did you know there's some pretty heavy stuff happening there? It's shocking, I know. And you'll find an awful lot of tribalism going on with it all. So here's a recent story. Israel halts all aid into Gaza as it demands Hamas accepts new ceasefire plan. If you scroll down just a bit, you're going to see all of the related article headlines, in this case over 400 of them, and with an awful lot of intense variation, ranging from explicit aims of ethnic cleansing to nothing more than yet another escalation in an already tense setting. Now, whatever your views, the key element here is that with the Ground News website and app, you're able to see how different media outlets are describing the exact same event. The precise language they're using, the things that they're emphasizing, and the things they're neglecting. It helps you to see the larger picture and to better understand the bias inherent to any one topic.
That is pretty funny that he hid paywalled sources, and there's 60 right-leaning sources, but only one of them isn't paywalled.
You can also track down the nature of the sources themselves. In this case, only 12% of the sources describing this topic are independently owned, while a whopping 48% belong to media conglomerates.
Now, one thing I will say specifically about this is I don't think ground news is useful, right? But to somebody who doesn't have the time to like comb through different news outlets and just determine based off of that, like how they lean politically, it's kind of useless. But uh, this is a pretty interesting graph because not a lot of people just know, what percent of, or like even just what like things are like. How do I put this? Not many people know like what media outlets are independently owned, individually owned, corporate owned, conglomerate owned, and or private equity. But it's that's like basically some of the only things that you can, like one of the only useful graphs that you can see, and you can Google all of this too. Like all of this is public information. It's legally all public information. But yeah.
Give a click on that portion, and you can even go deeper, seeing which companies and groups are responsible for what. You can even get a measure of the more objective factuality of each organization, which Ground News works with 3 independent news monitoring organizations to rate them all. In a day and age where information is cheap and truth is at a premium, I think you'll find a great deal of value in Ground News, which is why I'm so happy to be working on them for this sponsorship and to be able to offer you all 40% off of their Vantage plan for unlimited access.
Again, if you want to support him, go to his original video, use his link, yada, yada, yada.
When you visit groundnews.com. The conspiracy that the transatlantic slave trade was owned, controlled, and directed by Jewish people with the ultimate aim of using and abusing the black population as a sort of weapon against the white European and American populations seems to be, unfortunately, relatively common. Now, sometimes the people who propose these ideas will just out and say it, right? And other times they're going to be a little bit more cowardly and think that they need to dance around the issue to avoid the big, scary algorithms that won't let them use any racial slurs. It can be difficult to
I think one thing that's often missed here is that a lot of people will try to hide their political bias by proposing their opinion as a question rather than just stating their opinion. But in a lot of cases, it's purely just a kind of method of coercion, right? A lot of times it'll be like they'll sprinkle a little bit of truth in, and then they'll add the heapings of random stuff and then the crap on top. And like they'll lure you in with that little bit of truth, that little bit, and then they'll kind of dump the rest of it on you, like, oh well, they've been truthful so far. So a lot of times, and this does not apply to YouTube comments. This is just kind of a common thing you'll see with media influencers that are spreading misinformation.
pin down the precise nature of these individual conspiracies because they're typically vague and very ill-defined. It's sort of like playing.
There's a reason for that, is because the only reason that they're so ill-defined is because there's no actual backing for them historically, scientifically, what have you. So in a vacuum, right? A lot of people will kind of develop these opinions. Yeah, but what I'm trying to get at here is that you shouldn't form your political opinion without input from multiple people or multiple sources.
Playing whack-a-mole. You disprove one element and they can just infinitely contort the theory to have it pop up elsewhere.
And this is pretty common among conspiracy theories as well, where it is simply we've already surpassed. Okay, quick side note: we've already surpassed the length of the video in recording time, and we are not even halfway through. So prepare for a long one.
But all the same, it's why we're here, so I'll give it my best shot.
Basically, ooh, that's not a frame we want to pause on. Basically, I'm gonna rewatch this so I can have time to
prove one element and they can just infinitely contort the theory to have it pop up elsewhere.
And this is pretty common among conspiracy theories because again, because they don't really have a basis in science or in history or what have you. Basically, there is no way for them to actually prove their theory. So instead, they'll attempt to take their theory and use it to disprove your theory, or usually the correct theory. They'll take their theory, which is unproven, and try to use it to debunk a proven theory and try and claim their theory is proven.
But all the same, it's why we're here, so I'll give it my best shot. The Jews controlled the slave trade? Well, let's whack one mole, in this case, the largest slave trading company in transatlantic history, the English and later British Royal African Company.
The Royal African Company. I do believe this is superseded the right word? It predates the East India Company, if I remember correctly.
In a period of some 50 or 60 years or so, this single company embarked just under 200,000 persons. It was also the beginning of a serious British presence in the slave market, and so if the Jews really did control the entire thing, one would expect them to have a significant hand in it, right? Well, did they? The company was founded initially by the Duke of York, the future King James II, and funded by his family alongside a slew of private London investors. We know how that sounds. Now, who were those investors? Well, thankfully, we don't need to wonder at how many of them may have been Jewish,
right.
because we have a list of the shareholders, and it is filled to the brim with lords and sirs and captains and aldermen, even a few misses, in fact. There's Banks and Bences, Arlingtons and Jeffreys, quite a number of Dashwoods. Something going on with that family. Not a whole lot of
Captain Cock.
Jews. Now, I thought that Lavelle might be one at first, but no, turns out that's an English name too. And we get the same.
And this largely comes to the fact that it was at this time pretty much, and you can correct me if I'm misstating this or overstating it, it was pretty much illegal to be anything but Christian. Either Reformant or Protestant or Baptist Christian in the UK at this point, but I could be totally wrong on that. Citation needed.
Same story when we look at the company's directors and their committee members. We get a whole lot of English and Scottish nobles, even a Dutch engineer, not a lot of Jews, if any at all. But of course, that isn't the whole story. No. Because even if that happened to be the largest single company in the history of the transatlantic slave trade, it was hardly the entirety of it, right? It was a small fraction of the total trade. And before the British came into their own, another empire ruled the waves, the
I'm assuming it'd be the French.
Dutch. And
Dutch?
oh, how funny. But the Netherlands just so happened to have one of the largest concentrations of Jews in Europe. So much so that Amsterdam was sometimes called the Dutch Jerusalem. So surely this time, if we were to look into the details of their slave trade, we will see the clear Jewish influences.
And of course, this is taking into account one country out of the, let's see, 4 or 5 that had part in the slave trade, of course.
That these commenters insist is oh so obvious if only we just opened our eyes. I wish I had my tinfoil cocked hat that I could wear. That would have been a really nice touch, but
Okay, I've never seen that before. Okay, that's funny. That's funny. The tinfoil pirate hat, that's funny.
it's in a storage unit in Ohio. That's a real shame. Anyways, the Dutch West India Company, responsible for their African colonies and the shipment of slaves to the New World, was started in 1621 by the likes of Renier Pauw and Willem Uselinks, and of course Jesse de Forest. Oh yes, what Jewish names those
I had no picture to take this generic. So take this generic image of a Dutch ship landing slaves at Jamestown.
are. Oh, but it was funded, yes, it was funded by the Dutch government. okay? But also by private investors whose number did, in fact, include a number of prominent Jewish merchants, right alongside all the foreign investors, of course.
Yes.
Now, this time I don't have an exact list of every single shareholder, so it is possible, yes, that Jewish merchants were among those most heavily invested in this company. I'm not saying it is, it's possible though, right?
It's possible. There's, again, no way of telling historically without, a time machine or just a first-hand account or just a list, which we don't have, so.
But overall, we're hardly looking at a situation where there was some Jewish monopoly over the whole thing, right? Even where the Jewish community had arguably their highest level of influence in the Netherlands, right? They were only one party out of many with a vested interest in this trade. And whatever country you look at, well, the story is going to typically be the same. Whether it's the French with their Senegal Company and its many iterations, founded by Jean-Baptiste Ducasse at the request of King Louis XIV, or by looking at the Portuguese, who collectively transported by far the majority of slaves to the Americas through, among other means as well, this is just one of them, but through their Casa de India. Not only was the Casa de India formed by, again, the Portuguese government, but their slave trade was conducted through the express authority of the Pope, who declared that they only had the right to trade in human cargo if said cargo was, often forcefully, baptized into Christianity.
Fun.
It was an expressly Christian institution in Portugal, and if that is all a part of the evil Jewish plot, well, they have an interesting way of operating, don't they? So what about other nations? Well, for the part of the Spanish, they didn't have...
And I'm going to say this outright. I don't have much to say on this currently.
That heavy of a hand anyways in
this
the
is not my
African
realm of
slave trade. They
expertise.
relied mainly on natives for their forced labor, and whenever they did need African slaves, they would just buy them from other powers, mainly the British, I believe. And then meanwhile, the only other part of Europe with a significant Jewish population, being Eastern Europe, Poland and whatnot, well, they were hardly an international commercial powerhouse at the time, right?
Quickly move my seat a little bit so I'm a bit more centered in the camera. Much better, I think.
They weren't involved in the trade very heavily at all. But even still, of course, this is not the whole story. Now, most of these large slave trading companies, the French Senegal Company, the Royal African Company, the Casa de India, all these different things, right? They started off really strong in the 17th century, but by the early 18th century, mid-18th century, they're starting to lose their influence. They're even starting to lose their monopolies on the trade. More and more independent merchants and investors and ship owners would be gaining the rights in their respective societies to trade in slaves. And this is at a time when, so to say, the transatlantic economy is really starting to boom. The vast majority of slaves were being traded in the 18th century, and it's at the same time that it's really hard to make sweeping generalizations about who was doing that trading, because there were no single massive institutions behind it all. Like I said, the Royal African Company is typically held up as like one of, if not the largest slave trading institutions, but they only embarked around 200,000, a little under 200,000 out of a total, throughout the entire history of the trade, of some 12 plus million slaves. So here lies another opportunity then, if this trade was so disparate, right? It's another opportunity for conspiracists to make up stories about who really was controlling all of those ships. But there is no more reason to believe that the Jews had a proportionally greater interest in the trade than there is to believe it was controlled by any other group. And even if the Jewish population did have a greater level of influence, so to say, proportionally speaking, well, then there's even less cause to believe that there was some grand function, some grand narrative behind it all.
Again, this kind of goes back to that whole, if you were world-spanning controlling organization, why would you leave hints about it? Like, you would probably try and keep that a secret as much as you could.
Beyond the exact same reasons why any other nationality and race and creed, from African animists and Muslims to European Protestants and Roman Catholics, and yes, of course, the Jewish population, why any of them would be taking part in the trade, which is for material gain. The slave trade was a pervasive institution within which quite nearly every organization and every individual with any level of wealth would have a financial interest, be that interest in the actual physical shipments out of Africa, be it in the New World plantations, or even the myriad of industries which are springing up all around this stuff, from Massachusetts loggers and fishermen to London stockbrokers to Bristol dock workers. Now, if through all of that, right, if someone were to really dig through the archives and to collate a large list of all these different institutions and investors and ship owners and planters and all the various agents responsible for dealing with the African empires along the coastlines and everything else, right, if through all of those economic interests, those vested interests, through it all, they came out with an actual undeniable Jewish influence that they could document with sound and honest research, well, then we can have a conversation, right? But as of right now, I'm only seeing the crazy ramblings of YouTube comments filled with extra layer upon layer of conspiracy.
I'm just going to read this out. This is, again, this person's opinion, not mine. I'm reading this from the screen, right here on the screen, if you can't read it. Most slave traders were no white, or I'm assuming not white, mostly Arabian and Jews from the 1700s and up. So even now, there is still slavery in Africa. Well, that's because of corrupt systems. And yeah, slave hub of the world 20 years ago. Israel was the slave hub of the world 20 years ago before they fixed it, in quotation marks. Not only that, but there are 40 million slaves in the world, and 20 million of them are not good slaves. Not only that, but slaves were and still are expensive. Most people couldn't afford it unless they're rich enough already. Unless less than 1% of African Americans owns, or 1% of Americans own slaves. So and 0.7% of that 1% were Jewish. And there is no significant study to back up any of this. Any of the things that he said so far, this person has said so far, there is no historical evidence to back that up at all.
Theories that never,
besides like the 1%, I'm pretty sure,
hold up to even the most basic of informed inquiries. There might be questions or points that sound pretty damning or interesting, but then you look into it and it's like, oh, there's a very clear explanation that we've known forever. You're just ignoring that explanation, which is incidentally also far simpler than evil Jewish cabals, I guess.
Yeah. Now, again, I don't remember the right thing, that the right name for this, but it's the simplest solution is often the correct one.
Now, one of the silliest arguments that I've seen that relates to all that is that the vast majority of the ship owners were Jewish, and that even the ships themselves all had Hebrew names or Jewish names. Yeah, no, I pulled up a list of, for example, all the slave ships that docked in Bristol in 1749. We've got the Triton, Antelope, we've got the Alexander, Volunteer, Jamaica, Packet, Spy, Swift, Baltimore, Cornwall. They've got Latin names, they've got Greek names. The closest that we get to a Jewish name was the King David. which can
Yeah.
also be a Christian name, right?
Yeah.
Wikipedia has an even longer list where they are also listing people like the ship owners and the ship's operators, where we get the likes of Captain Murdoch Murchie, or Thomas Flynn, or Nathaniel Gordon, and of course, the infamous William Gregson, co-owner of the slave ship Zong. The ships were named after cultural and historical icons. They were named for personality traits or family members, loved ones, significant events, and yes, some of them had names rooted in religious symbolism, but they could just as easily be Christian as anything else.
And a lot of thing with another thing is Judaism and Christianity do share a few commonalities between each other. So I can assume that a lot of it can be written off as similarities between Judaism and Christianity.
Incidentally, so many of those early Christian figures are applicable to Judaism as well, right? Until this Jesus guy comes around, it's the same books, right? Their captains and their owners, the chief investors, likewise, they're coming from every walk of life, depending on the society that they happen to be in and what society the slave ships are coming from. Like I said, we're just playing whack-a-mole at this point. But none of this will actually matter to the hardcore conspiracists, because when you begin with your conclusion, the facts don't matter. When you move through highly complicated histories with the specific aim of finding a single root cause, curating through whatever facts are useful to you and discarding the ones that aren't, you're going to find whatever you want. That's, of course, to say nothing about how you can just outright lie if you don't really believe in the conspiracy yourself, but there's
You and I spread misinformation on the internet.
some external function behind your holding it. Not that that would ever happen in modern day politics, right? An example of a curated fact, did you know that, I actually read this in an article written by a rabbi, by the by, Jacob Rader Marcus. Did you know that in the late 18th century, some 40% of all Jewish households owned slaves? And in some communities like Charleston, South Carolina, which was a hotbed, incidentally, of slaving activity, that figure was closer to 75%? By God, we can take that and run with it. The Jews controlled it all. Well, that's right. Out of the roughly 51,000 slaves in Charleston in 1790, Jews owned a whole 93 of them. So again, Jewish people of the time were not exempt from the evils of slavery, but no population was, right? They were few in number, but all the same, on average, better off for a whole slew of historical and legal, cultural, and economic reasons that ultimately dated back to the Middle Ages. And when people were better off, whoever they were, they would have had a hand in the slave trade. The same way that the nobility did, or for that matter, the Roman Church did. Where the Jews were not on average wealthier, like say in Poland, they weren't at the heads of these tables. So let's have yet another narrative shift. Okay, so the Jews evidently didn't start the trade, nor did they dominate it for most of its history, but maybe they actually ran the whole show in the United States. After all, we know it's always been a conspiracy that hates America, I guess. Later on in the 19th century, they may have controlled it, where it directly led to so much White Death in the Civil War, and where all those dastardly different colored people are residing. Yes, it's always been an anti-American conspiracy, don't you see? Just ignore, I guess, how in 1830, for example, out of the 40,000 or so slave owners, well, yeah, only like 120 of them were Jewish. But they were the most powerful families of the bunch, don't you see? Everyone else treated their slaves so well, but it was those 120, they're the real evil. Didn't you know that the largest slave trading companies within the United States were all run by the Jews? Oh, yeah. Like
I'm sure there's
the
historical
largest
backing
and
for that.
arguably the most powerful company in
I'm definitely sure there's historical backing for that, right?
the history of the American slave trade, Franklin and Armfield. Franklin and Armfield.
Franklin and Armfield. I don't think I've ever seen anything less Jewish.
To quote the comedian Lenny Bruce, I don't think that I can imagine a more goyish name than Franklin and Armfield. But a name, yeah, that's it. A name doesn't always betray the Jew. It's a matrilineal line. They could be hiding among any one of us. The Wikipedia articles are
And here we go back to Nazi propaganda, which is just a bit more my speed.
all edited by the cabal. The archives are corrupted. The schools have been infiltrated. Every government in the world has fallen. The conspiracy is all around. The conspiracy.
And the worst part is the conspiracy comes from a lot of people within places of power within the government.
Is whatever you need it to be. It will bend and contort to fit whatever tiny little space it is allowed. And unfortunately, there will always be space in history because so much of history is inherently unknowable. Our understanding of the past will always be flawed. It will always have gaps, regardless of how good our methodologies become and how firm the research becomes, right? Because, and then even beyond, right, all of that, right, even when things are academically understood and sound knowledge, like, for example, the ownership of the slave trade, right, so long as all the same individual persons remain ignorant of those material details, because there are so many material details and they're so complicated, so there's always going to be, people who are ignorant of little things, right, all over. I mean, everyone has that, right? Well, then it doesn't really matter, because the conspiracists will be able to exploit that individual ignorance and use it to...
Again, it really comes back to my argument is right. What backing do you have for that? No backing, but I know that yours is wrong, and that means that mine is right. And so there's no backing to that argument whatsoever.
Push forward
for the most part.
flawed narratives. The idea that the Jews dominated the slave trade, let alone had some overarching goal behind it, is highly selective at its best, and at its worst, it's just an outright lie. Within those societies with an economic interest in the African trade, as it was called, everyone had their fingers in the pie to some degree or another. Those investors, as it were, sometimes included Jews, yes, but rarely, if ever, in a significantly greater proportion of wealthy persons than any other group. Everyone was involved, everyone profited, except for the slaves themselves. The Jewish population, right, they were no more pure. I'm not saying that. There were many Jewish people involved in the slave trade. It's not like being Jewish was all of a sudden made you exempt from the whole thing. They were no more pure, but they were also no less virtuous than any other group of people, however you want to draw the lines of what constitutes a group and what doesn't. They're no more pure, no less virtuous than any other group of people in this manner. So, I mean, even to begin ascribing moral sentiments to entire populations, let alone to ascribe vast conspiracies, it's ridiculous. That's a whole other conversation, though. And I'm starting to ramble again, all right, when I've already explained all of this at the video's start. And again, to those who are already convinced of the conspiracy, even if they made it this far in the video, my words probably won't mean anything. The words of the historian are to them useless because the conspiracy isn't really historiographical, it's personal.
And I think... Hold on, just go back a little bit.
The words of the historian are to them useless because the conspiracy isn't really historiographical, it's personal.
And this is another thing that you'll see with a lot of conspiracy theories is that especially with Flat Earth, is it kind of builds a community that would have never really been there without it. So people find a sense of community within these conspiracy theories, or a group of people under the belief of this conspiracy theories.
So, at the end of all of this, why bother making this video, right? Why bother making any of these videos? Well, there is, of course, the small chance that it does convince someone, but more so, I believe that having this kind of specific material knowledge of these complicated issues is the best way to help us ward against conspiracy within ourselves and to further call it out whenever we see it out in the world in person, thus in turn helping to guard others, external observers we might say, against it as well. And even further than the specific facts, which are always susceptible to that eternal game of whack-a-mole, right? It's the wider rhetoric on which these flawed arguments, in this case about slavery, rest. So, in all of those regards, for those reasons, I hope that you found this video interesting, and I hope that you found it thought-provoking. I hope you learned a little bit more about the nature of the transatlantic slave trade, and that it might have even inspired a few additional questions for you to continue your own research. And if that
I think I'm going to stop it here. Just to kind of build off of what he's been saying this kind of entire video, is that a lot of times with conspiracy theories that are inherently irrational or inherently accusatory is there's not really that much of a historical backing behind many of them, if any of them. So in a lot of cases, people will create straw men to kind of exemplify their point. And there's oftentimes a historical precedent behind that doesn't really it doesn't matter to them is what I'm trying to say. But I think that's where I'm going to stop the recording, given we are 1 hour in and I've still got to edit all of this, so blur some things just because they would not fly on a channel as small as mine. So I'll see you all next time.